Welcome back to Groups. I am so excited to be here with Becca, who is joining us for our series Be Nice. Becca is our early childhood director here at the church, and just so glad to have you a part of this conversation. Today, we're talking about kindness and compassion. Kind of a big deal, but maybe could you share a time when you witnessed an act of compassion that impacted you?
Yeah, so fun fact about me, before this, I was working to study law enforcement. So I actually did some ride-alongs and went to the police academy very briefly. But during one of those ride-alongs, we were involved with an armed robbery. And the officer I was with happened to be the person to catch the guy. And so I watched this officer go from a very high stress situation to where it would be very easy for him to slip in and pretend like this wasn't an actual real person. But instead of continuing that high intensity conversation where he could just shove him in the car and take him to jail, he paused. And he took a pause and he offered this guy water. He offered to let him smoke, which would help that situation, but actually took a moment to treat him like a real person.
Like a human being.
Like a human being. But seeing that compassion, especially at the time, this was the height of a very high intense situation with law enforcement in general. It was awesome to see that.
Yeah, I think that's a great start for compassion, is to see people as people and not as statistics, problems, stereotypes, all of that stuff, to see people for who they are as image bearers of God. And so that's one place that compassion starts. One of the things that we see right off the bat in Jesus's ministry, he starts off with all of these acts of compassion. He teaches the people we read in Matthew 5-7, the Sermon on the Mount. He does all of this teaching. And then right after that is just episode after episode of him doing an act of compassion. Rather than read through 2 chapters of just thing after thing after thing, I thought I would just kind of read us through just the highlight notes of that. So in Jesus' ministry, right off the bat, he heals a man with leprosy, and then he heals a Roman official's paralyzed servant. So now he's crossing over the political divide in order to bring compassion. He heals Peter's mother-in-law who was sick. She gets up, makes everyone a meal, and all of a sudden, every person who was sick or demon-possessed in the whole town shows up at Jesus's door. And so then he starts healing them. I don't know that I would have that kind of response. Be like, oh my goodness, go away. But he invites them in, and he does healing there. He then tries to get alone to pray, and they cross over to the other side of the lake. A storm comes up. The disciples are afraid. He has compassion on them. He calms the storm and talks to them about their fears. He heals a demon-possessed man by casting the demons out into some pigs. And then there's this kind of story of, are we going to be more compassionate towards these pigs or towards people, or these pigs have more value than people did? It's just a really interesting conversation. He then heals a paralyzed man because their friends bring them to Jesus on a mat. They show compassion, and then he shows compassion by forgiving his sins and healing him. And then he calls Matthew to come follow him and be one of his disciples. And people don't like that he's hanging out with sinners, and he stands up for Matthew as a person. Yeah. And then a leader of the synagogue, so a religious leader, his daughter dies. Jesus goes and says, no, she's only sleeping. He awakes her up, raises her from the dead, and she is now alive again. And then there are 2 blind men that he heals. And then finally, there's a demon-possessed man that Jesus heals. And the Pharisees see this, they hear this, and because their hearts are hard against Jesus and all that he's been doing, they claim that the only reason why Jesus can do any of this is because he is empowered by demons himself. Right. And so that is where our scripture that we're going to read kind of kicks up, is right after this episode after episode, compassion after compassion. We're going to read a passage of scripture about that. But before we do, I think one of the things that I really notice about Jesus is our compassion must be fueled by faith. That things can actually change. Like with Jesus, when he shows up on the scene, things can change. And it kind of leads to one of our core values as a church. Our value is that we believe in bold invitation because beneath that is this desire and this belief that the gospel is life-changing for everyone. And so when we think of compassion, it's got to be fueled first by our faith.
Yeah.
Anything that you want to say about that?
I mean, that's like a whole lot to unpack. Like,
Yeah.
we usually will spend like a whole Sunday on like one of those
Right.
stories. But yeah, like Jesus, I mean, he talked the talk and then he walked the walk and he crossed all the boundaries. Like there was like, if it was someone who should have been seen as an enemy or if it was a child or a woman, it didn't matter to him. He walked it.
Yeah.
And it was very clear that was faith driven and he was on the move. And
Yeah.
that same power that was true back then is true today. And
Yeah.
we have to own that.
Yeah. I want you to read this passage of scripture for us. This is right after Jesus does all of that.
All right, so it says in verse 35, Jesus has traveled through all the towns and villages of that area, teaching in the synagogues and announcing the good news about the kingdom. He healed every kind of disease and illness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were confused and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. He said to his disciples, "The harvest is great, but the workers are few. So pray to the Lord who is in charge of the harvest. Ask him to send more workers into his fields." I look at that scripture and I see it from the kids ministry perspective. So like most Sundays, we have some child that's going to have some kind of meltdown. And I always look at them and like, oh, like from a toddler's perspective, they don't know how to handle this situation. They have so many emotions that are spilling out of them. They just don't know any better. And to me, Jesus looked at those people and he had compassion for them and he felt like they were helpless. They needed guidance. They needed a shepherd.
Yeah. Yeah. I think some things that we learn from Jesus, if we're going to be people of compassion first, we have to be people who see needs. Everywhere he went, he just saw the needs of the people, so much so that it like moved him to compassion. Like, this isn't right. Like, somebody has to do something. And so it's not just seeing the needs, though. We got to take action to meet the needs. And then our next step is compassion leads the way. Again, Jesus is making this new way, making all things new. And we can have faith to believe that we don't have to, even if we feel like, oh, I'm a behind the scenes person, God still calls us to lead in our compassion and all of our gifting that we have to extend his compassion to others. And then the last one is pray for workers. I love that. Like, you don't have to do this alone.
No.
Yeah.
No.
We shouldn't.
We shouldn't. Jesus, I mean, of course he could have done it alone, but he didn't. He chose not to. And he partnered with people. But I mean, all of those steps are important. That seeing is like an action in and of itself. Like, you have to take a moment and see. All of us are busy and it's very easy to just focus on your task and what you need to get done for the day. But even in that path of busyness, there's things that you can see. And then, like you said, seeing's not enough. Then it's the action behind it and leading, and then not forgetting to pray for those workers and that help that we all need.
Yeah. Well, in your groups today, you're going to have an opportunity to talk about the areas of your life where you see the need for compassion to move, maybe in your workplace, your school, your neighborhood, and just get to talk about those things and maybe what God is calling you to do. And hopefully spend some time together praying for other people to join you in those acts of compassion that he has for you. As always, we hope that you have a great week. We hope that you are a church that's known for love, and be nice.
Be nice.